In this part of the video, we're going to discuss checking your brake fluid, your brake pads, and making sure that your bike is safe to ride before you get on it. You should do these checks every day. You may need to buy some .4 brake fluid. This is quite a large container. This will probably last the average person about 4 years. You may need to buy a tiny bit of this to top up. You may need to purchase brake pads, which are available through Sinnis for your particular bike. I will say that we're not going to discuss bleeding the brake system in this video due to the fact that although to some it's quite an easy process, it can actually, if done incorrectly, cause ineffectual brakes. So we will leave bleeding brakes to a Sinnis dealer. So if you feel that your fluid has gone below the level totally, or your brakes are particularly spongy, you will need to contact your Sinnis dealer in order to have your brakes checked. So today we're going to talk about one of the most important safety checks you should do before riding your bike, which takes literally 10 seconds, and that is checking your brake fluid in your front and rear master cylinder. Low brake fluid will cause spongy brakes not to work, cause your brakes to judder, and many other things. Overheating brakes can all be caused by low brake fluid. It takes 2 seconds to check, it takes about 5 minutes to top up. So we're going to talk about that in today's video. All Sinnis motorcycles and scooters on the top of the master cylinder will tell you what type of brake fluid to use on your bike or scooter. Now, there's generally 3 types of brake fluid out there. Quite uncommon, .3, very, very common, .4, and very, very common, .5.1. There is no need to use .5.1, that is a race temperature fluid. We recommend always .4. If you read the packet of the .4, you will see that most .4s are compatible also with .3, so you can mix the two, just top it up, there's no problem whatsoever. What you do need to bear in mind is that when you open a packet of brake fluid to pour it in, once you've finished topping up, generally you need to dispose of the rest of the brake fluid that you might have left over. This is to stop air getting into it, which can get into the brake system if you use it in, say, 2 months' time to top up again. It also stops dust and agents like that getting into it. It seems a bit of a waste, but you can buy quite small packs of brake fluid, which will, easily fill them up, and then you won't have much to waste. Okay, so today we're going to use the RSX 125 as an example. Front master cylinder, that's this box here, that contains your brake fluid and will have a sight glass on it telling you how much fluid is in there. You want to keep it between the lower and the upper. Towards the upper is obviously always better. If you can't see anything in there, I am not in this video going to teach you how to bleed the brakes, because it can be quite dangerous if not done by a professional. So if you can't see any fluid in there at all, I would advise taking it to your local Sinnis dealer for them to check and potentially bleed the system. What you're looking at is always topping it up so it's at the upper level. You're probably talking a couple of months, sometimes even a year before you need to top it up, but it's worth checking every time you ride, because if you don't check it and it does drop too low and you have no brake fluid in there, it can be a sign of a leak. It can be a sign that your brakes aren't going to work when you need them most. So the first thing to do is we take a screwdriver. I always wear gloves as well, because brake fluid is quite dangerous stuff. The main thing you want to do is keep brake fluid off your paintwork. It goes straight through the paintwork relatively quickly, so if you do spill it on there, I would advise wiping it off as quickly as possible, getting a damp cloth as well and wiping it off even more with that. But that said, we need to undo the 2 screws on the top of the master cylinder. Now, on most bikes, not all of our Sinnis bikes, but on most bikes, under this top you have a plastic cap which holds what's called a diaphragm in place. This is a rubber, can't get it out, this is a rubber diaphragm which basically makes sure that no air can get into here once the whole system is sealed. So topping it up here, we're going to use a brake fluid which is a .4 brake fluid. As I say, this is pretty much standard throughout all motorcycles except for like race bikes, track bikes or high performance super bikes. This kit, to put it for an example, this bottle is £4 retail, so it's not very expensive. I would recommend before pouring it in, just have a piece of cloth near you, just so that if you do make any spillage you can quickly mop it up. So basically you check the upper and lower levels and you gently pour in some of the brake fluid so that it reaches the upper level. So after you top this level back up, what you want to do is carefully check the diaphragm to make sure there's no splits. there won't be any splits in it, but just make sure there is no splits or anything like that, and there's no dirt on the top of the metal of your master cylinder. What you want to do is put that on gently and tap it down so it forms a lovely seal that no air can get in. Once that's in place, then you apply the plastic cover over the top. Like I say, not all of the Sinnis bikes have got the plastic cover on the top. This is the RSX and they have. And then you can put this cover over the top of it all and screw it down tightly. Once that system is there, once this is screwed in place, no air can enter the system. Basically, air is the enemy when it comes to brakes. Air bubbles in the brakes can cause the brake to judder and become quite spongy. So with the RSX, the rear master cylinder is located here just above the exhaust, under the seat. This doesn't require a screwdriver to undo. It's simple unscrew. It should be tight, but it's quite simple to unscrew. Inside the lid, the same as the front, you've got a plastic cover and you've got a diaphragm, which should all be in very good shape. If there's any splits or anything in those, you need to consult your dealer. This has got an upper and lower level on it, and you can top up your brake fluid straight into this. Again, if it's low, so low that you can't see the brake fluid, you need to consult your dealer about adding brake fluid and getting it possibly bled. So you can just add some brake fluid in there, bring it up to the upper level. Again, the same with the front master cylinder. The diaphragm needs to be seated nicely on the top with no gravel or anything like that in between, and then you can slowly tighten this up. Make sure it's quite tight, and that's the whole system airtight and working perfectly. The next thing we're going to check is the brake pads themselves, just a visual check to make sure they haven't worn down too much. Brake pads, the same as brake fluid really. If they start to squeal too heavily, that can be a sign that they're running low and you're running metal against the disc. If they are very, very low, you'll find that your level of travel with your front brake or rear brake lever is more than before, and it can also be quite spongy. That meaning that when you put the brake on, it doesn't feel to do anything, and then all of a sudden it bites. It's not something you want, so you want your brakes to be quite progressive and keep them in good shape. So we're going to check the brake pads now to have a look and make sure, quick 5-second check before you go riding. So as seen here on the RSX 125, quick check of the brake pad. In here you'll see the pads which meet against the disc. Basically, to cut a long story short, when you press the rear or indeed the front brake on a combined bike like this, those pads will clamp the disc together and you'll slow down. If you haven't got enough meat on the pads in here, basically when you press the brakes it will find it harder to slow you down. So if you start noticing that your brakes drop off in power, it can check your fluid is the main thing, but it can always be your brake pads wearing down. These are a serviceable item and should always be checked at every service, but it takes 2 seconds to check it before you ride the bike anyway. What you're looking for is a large amount of material in there. Between this metal pad and that metal disc, you're looking for quite a sizable piece of material in there. If that material gets as low as say 5 mil, you need to look at changing those pads straight away. They're quite inexpensive, they can be purchased through Sinnis parts department, but that is the best way to keep your brakes fully maintained. Okay, so one last main check with the brakes. This is generally, you can check this while you're riding. It's a natural thing. If you've been riding for a while, you'll understand it. If you're brand new to it, it's something new, so I want to just quickly explain. Disc warpage, basically when the discs get very, very hot, not on a daily basis, but if you've used a disc a lot, if the bike's say at 2,000 kilometers and you're quite a heavy braker, you can get warpage on the disc, and that is basically where the disc goes round, it's just slightly warped. So there's ways of noticing that that's happening, and one way is if you ride slowly, I'm talking sub 10 miles an hour, maybe 5 miles an hour, gently apply the front brake, and I mean seriously gently, just so the brake's applied, you can feel it working against the bike, but you're not stopping. If that brake starts to be juddery and you can feel it, the potential is that you have got warped discs. The same with the rear. You can do low speed control, which you've probably learnt in CBT, using the rear brake, drive in a straight line 5 to 10 miles an hour maximum, gently apply the rear brake, which is obviously combined on this, and if it judders and you feel it through the pedal, that is generally a warped disc. It's not the end of the world. Again, discs are available through Sinnis, they're quite cheap. We always suggest that if you have new discs, you have new pads, because the pad tends to work itself into the shape of the disc. And so that is another quick check to do while you're riding or before you go riding.